Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Hunter Peterson. I'm the clinic director at Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts, and this is the monthly open forum. So I'm going to take a quick second actually to talk about the history of open forum because now I only do one of these every third month, and this started as an in-person gathering at Pilgrim's Market here in Coeur d'Alene, and we would gather and speak about health topics. And it's called open forum because I really want to still preserve the integrity that what I really feel is quite beneficial also about this meeting is we can talk about any and all health topics, not just the lecture topic that I kind of have announced to the community. So I just want to remind everybody that if there is anything you wanted to talk about that's totally unrelated to the field guide to nutritious food, feel free to pop it through the message chat, the chat box, and I'm happy to circle back to it at the end of the lecture and go over questions or curiosities of how you want to pick my brain. So I forget to use that disclaimer at the beginning, and it's just a good reminder. And I know that I'll be kind of speaking more rapid fire here through this topic in the hour we have. And so I also just want to, use that chat feature as a prominent way to get your questions within the topic answered too. So don't hesitate to fire a question through if that would feel helpful. So I am going to launch into now the discussion that I have very thoughtfully placed this lecture of mine at the time of year I am doing it, which is May 17th. And if I'm like some of you, I would imagine, we have all just finished or are finishing the process of getting our seeds or our starts in the ground in our home garden. I see a couple of people on the call who I know I've talked about their home gardens with them. So it's that time of year where we get to actually kind of really come back to our, ancestral roots and grow our own food, which, as you'll get to learning about in this topic, is probably the most directly nutritious, dynamic way to consume food is homegrown out of your own soil with your own love and care. So it's not too late to get a garden in the ground as well. If this talk or, just you're inspired to, it's a really beautiful thing in my personal life. And it has this dual benefit of providing me really nourishing, healthy food that's the most healthy things I could possibly consume, while also being really heart and spirit nourishing for me to get my hands in the dirt and to just ground myself in that process of being with plants and being with soil, and always with my shoes off and doing some good earthing. There's all sorts of research about how being in your garden and in your yard barefooted is touching the ground is super beneficial to the electromagnetic systems in your body on a many levels. So don't forget to use that as you march through the beautiful warm months that we get to have for the next few months. That all being said, this topic I like to introduce, as many topics I like to introduce, being a lover of history and was a major in history in undergraduate, and then did medical anthropology work in my medical student career. I think it's really cool to start with talking about the history of human relationship with food and how we come from our ancestral roots to modern day with the food that we put in our body and where that food comes from, the nature of that food, and eventually how it's prepared and all those things. So if you go back to the beginning of human history, what we characterize maybe between 50,000 and 5,000 years ago, you examine a species that is characterized as hunters and gatherers. So what that means is that we foraged for all the food we consumed, which to a small degree was animal products, like, animals that would be killed or trapped or scavenged. But the vast majority of what we ate were wild plants, wild beans, wild fruit, wild vegetables, wild root vegetables, wild nuts and seeds. These would be what we, in a migratory fashion, would gather when things were in season and available and ripening, and those that could be stored long term, we would derive ways to store them. And that's how humans existed. And one of the things about that to really understand is that when foods grow in the wild, they are exposed to a lot of forces that basically are stressors on the plants. In other words, there's competition from other plants, there's predation from insects and other animals, there are environmental and climate forces, there's geographical forces that affect a plant's ability to survive. And so in doing that, in order to survive, plants have to create strategies to maintain their existence. And as we get into that topic, it's very fascinating, because what plants do to survive largely is they create a lot of what are called phytochemicals, or also known as phytonutrients. These are essentially compounds that are generated and secreted into the vegetable or fruit or nut or seed or bean to enable it to be more resilient in its environment, to either be unpalatable to predators or survive more strongly in climate conditions or with competition. And so one of the things when the agricultural revolution happened about 5,000 years ago, and humans evolved into these more from nomadic into more permanent settlements and societies, is we removed a lot of those forces that led to the creation of plants that had a higher concentration of phytonutrients. And included, I would argue too, was usually more fiber, because that higher fibrous category helped them survive better. And so even 5,000 years ago, we were moving away from consuming the most dense version of nutrition from plants, which would be wild foraged plants. Something maybe to note, in one day I would really like to do, so you got to put a pin in this, but I would really love to do a plant walk in our community, like a wild plant walk where we point out edible and medicinal species in our local Coeur d'Alene, North Idaho, inland Northwest region, because there's actually edible food all around us, and that's probably arguably the most nutrient dense food we can consume. So, just again, putting a pin in that and circle back to it, I would love to do that someday. I should say I will do that someday. But moving forward in our agricultural evolution, as we call it, humans learned how to take wild things that were edible and domesticate them. And when you say domesticate, you essentially mean that cultivate them in soils with irrigation and more controlled environments that eliminate competition, that eliminate predators, that eliminate harsh environmental realities. And this happened first in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia in the Middle East and Africa, and then spread throughout the rest of the world. And it was what allowed humans to continue to evolve and, cultivate other interests like leisure things, et cetera, because they had more readily available food and didn't have to spend all their day foraging and hunting and gathering. What came along with this is the ability for humans to select as they bred and reproduced the crops they were building, like the grains or the beans or the nuts and seeds or the fruit trees, or, you take all of these wild foods, but then start to cultivate them as agriculture in a settlement, you basically can take the produce or the seeds or the fruits of that plant and say, this one tastes sweeter, this one has a bigger yield, this one is prettier, this one has more fat, this one has, basically the more desirable taste traits and caloric traits, and select for them as you breed generations. So one of the things that began to happen in that process is we actually moved away from the more nutritious ancestral foods, which usually would be smaller, more bitter, more fibrous, thicker skinned, in order to select for those more desirable traits. So also we when we started domesticating, not only did we change the environmental factors that made the plants make less phytonutrients, then we started actively selecting for plants that had less phytonutrients, but higher calorie density, higher sweetness value, et cetera. So it's just a kind of interesting thing that's evolved in those eras, but where things really started to crank up and how our ancestral food patterning has shifted is really in the last couple hundred years. And there's a constellation of forces involved in that. The first force in that would be this idea that we could much more rapidly essentially do plant husbandry or reproduce and select for different plant strains much more quickly than our ancestors would. So it's still that same process of selecting the most desirable phenotypic traits, which is like the appearance and nature of the plant, but we could just do it a lot quicker than we could when we'd have to wait whole life cycle generations in the past. So that was one big change. And then even more modernly, this is in the last 100 years, we've been able to build this capacity to hybridize and actually genetically modify the plants that are the core foundation of our nutrition. And that's where arguably we've built the most rapid harm into the food value and health versus toxic accumulation of our food. Because one of the main ways, for example, we have genetically modified our food is essentially to make our plants that we eat resistant to pesticides and herbicides that we spray on them. So spray really toxic chemicals, but insert genes into those plants that doesn't allow them to be killed by those toxic chemicals in order to increase our yields by killing off the pests and killing off the competition. So a lot of what's come into being in the last 100 years is the use of chemical pesticides and herbicides to kill weeds and insects for the sake of increasing the yield and concentration of our crop growing. And, from a demographic standpoint, the reason this has happened is not necessarily all a bad thing. I mean, we're confronting the reality of exponential growth in population. And if you grow your population, you have to grow more food. We're animals, we still have to fuel our bodies. We can't eat air. So this is part of why we've made these adaptations. It's not like it's purely sinister why we've done this, but nevertheless, the endpoint implication is that there's way more toxic residues on our foods than ever. Furthermore, when we genetically hybridize or modify our food, we essentially much more rapidly move away from those core phytonutrient, fiber kind of, nutrient enriching properties to less nutritionally dense foods. Like an example is modern wheat, right? What we desire the most is the sticky, gooey, fluffy, glutinous core of the wheat we consume versus the bitter, rough, fibrous shell that the gluten germ is kind of nestled within. So through hybridization and genetic modification, we've amplified the gluten content of wheat hundreds and hundreds of times from its ancestral, roots. And that has huge implications. And we're seeing the health catastrophe of modern wheat in our society at present, with really no medical recognition of its destructiveness. So it's just one example amongst many I could name of the problem of what modern agriculture has created. Those herbicides and pesticides are very insidious ramifications to our health in terms of us consuming those toxic residues. And I hate to throw another further wrench in it, but some of you might say, oh, well, if I eat organic, I'm safe. I won't have to worry about that. Unfortunately, that does not guarantee there's not pesticide, herbicide residues on your food. It just means that the organic bar is slightly higher than non-organic food in terms of the types of pesticides and herbicides that need to be used. So why I partly say that is that we got to wash our food, right? All of our vegetables and grains and seeds and legumes and beans, wash and rinse it, because at least you're getting a huge proportion of those residues off your food before you consume it. So that's a step we should all be taking if we're willing to take the time to remove those toxins off our foods. Now, another thing in this modernization of agriculture, when we've really intensively cultivated soils and started to use fertilizers and kind of basically putting toxins into the soil to kill bugs and competition, is we've really started to hammer the health of the soil itself. And of course, many of the plants that are the foundation of our food rely on sunlight and water as their primary nutrients, but the other core elements of nutrients that are utterly crucial is the soil that they grow up in, and how we return a lot of those nutrients back into the soil and really keep soil healthy. Modern agriculture has tragically trampled that wisdom of nature's process in that, and in doing so, we've rapidly depleted nutrients out of our soils. One of the biggest examples of that is the mineral magnesium. Magnesium is a very, very crucial mineral to our body. So it has hundreds of cofactor dependent reactions from our brain to our metabolism to our hormones, amongst major cardiovascular roles and neurological tissue roles. It has basically been depleted by over 80% out of our soils. So when you get to talking about the concept of supplements, which you'll find me to be a doctor that's not super aggressive with encouraging people to supplement. I'm all about food as medicine, but I have to acknowledge that there are some, minerals and vitamins and nutrients that our soils just don't contain anymore because of modern agriculture. And consequently, we are all benefited from supplementing to replace what we're missing from what we really need out of our foods. So minerals and B vitamins are two really big examples of that I'm pretty aggressive with almost everybody and saying, this is a good idea for you. There is a path to regenerating our soils. It involves essentially doing the slow process of transforming back to the old wisdom ways of our historical agricultural systems. But it also probably requires realistically that we kind of slow down our population growth. And I think that's a reality that's much bigger and further beyond this food conversation. But we simply need to be able to, work our soils and our environment at a sustainable pace and grow food at a sustainable pace. But there's also really exciting future inroad areas, hydroponics, growing nutrients off of different microbes. So many exciting worlds that science is also entering into. So it's a very dynamic future to look at. So enough of that piece. What I will now go into is as we kind of have modernized where we're at now with our agriculture and food, I guess I should say that really what we've only talked about so far is whole foods, right? We're only talking about assuming that everybody is really taking all of these plants from our environment and consuming them in whole fashions. But even that is obviously radically not true. we all know that most of us have probably lived this way very strongly. If some of us have evolved to a more whole foods diet, that's great. But probably everybody on this call is not old enough to have not grown up in the scientific revolution of processed food of the baby boomer era. Processed food kind of came into being a few decades before that, but it just became culturally the standard of health and medical wisdom to consume processed food. And that's also when fast food arose, is in that generation. And so really, we're confronted with a society that not only has lost out on all those evolutional changes to food, but then the further industrial change in food to strip down and break down and repackage, plant substances into what I would not call food. They're chemical enhanced, substances really that we're putting in our bodies and calling food, but they have labels of dozens of ingredients and preservatives and toxins and dyes and essentially refined, shells of foods that have very little nutritional value. So I guess I should make that disclaimer in this talk that first and foremost, we got to acknowledge and accept that even if we're, using canned whole food, it's a lot better than eating processed food. We'll get into all the optimal ways you can consume food, but the first thing to do is make a commitment to yourself or a desire to move in a direction of less processed food. And, I'm not getting into meat and animal products as heavily today, but generally look at our ancestors and how they functioned and thrived the best. They ate a lot less animal products than our society has evolved to. And so although I'll touch on animal products, my general encouragement is to become much more plant-based in our way of consuming food. I see that the standard American diet is consuming like 30 to 50% of its calories from animal substances, whereas we probably should be more close to like 10%, 20% at most for maybe particularly those people with O blood types. So I just kind of give that disclaimer before I really break down this next topic, which is really diving into a field guide to nutritious food analysis, storage, preparation, consumption. So that's where we'll head now. So I actually, when I want to talk about food and like what the core constituents are that we're putting in our bodies, I want to maybe go to the use of like reading a nutritional label. So if you were to somehow be able to like have a nutritional label alongside, say, like a box of whole almonds on the shelf, what you're going to see is a breakdown of a few things. You're going to see a breakdown of vitamins and minerals. You're going to see a breakdown of fiber. I think the FDA requires them to place sugar and salt because of the health implications of sugar and salt. That's just required. And then they're going to require them to have the macro constituents. How many calories from carbohydrate, how many calories from fat, how many calories from protein. So in essence, when we look at foods and examine foods, that gives you quite a bit of information about the food, but it is utterly incomplete in terms of the other dynamics, particularly for live foods like fruits and vegetables, most so, that really contain information about the other dynamic compounds that are so necessary to our health. And again, that comes back to this concept of phytochemicals, or phytonutrients means plant nutrients. And so those compounds are exquisitely crucial to our health and well-being. Those phytochemicals are actually what, at the end of the day, all of our botanical medicines, homeopathic medicines, and prescription medicines are derived from. They're taking things from nature they're concentrating them to really high levels and repackaging them in a way for humans to consume. But it's always why I use this term food as medicine, is because, in my opinion, a lot of these beautiful compounds that really nurture our health are available to us readily in our foods, as if we're eating live, whole foods, particularly fruits and vegetables. Okay, so that's those phytonutrients, unfortunately, don't get really, contained in a food label, nor do we even generate labels for our fresh fruits and vegetables. So it's just it's a jumping off point. But when we look at those phytonutrients and what they do in the body, there are some super dynamic, crucial roles. And one of the big buzz terms that you'll want to bring forth from this is the concept of antioxidants. So antioxidants are this compound in the body that essentially quells and quenches the process of oxidation. The number one cause of aging and disease, arguably, could be made is the degenerative oxidative process going on at the cellular level in our body. So these antioxidant compounds in our foods, there's thousands and thousands of them, are very dynamic in protecting our tissue, our cells, against that oxidative aging process. And, again, there's certainly highlighted foods that have particularly high concentrates of antioxidants. The cruciferous family of veggies, one of the features that really distinguishes a high antioxidant value is the bitterness. That usually means that there's a lot of antioxidant capacity to it. Interestingly, when you consume wild food, foraged food, they're usually very bitter, also have a very high antioxidant profile. And so these antioxidants are super crucial, and that's why these dynamic live foods are so necessary and important. We can concentrate antioxidants and make nutrients out of them. There are things like, what are some examples of what people take? Let's see, we have lutein, zeaxanthin are eye antioxidants. You have grapeseed extract. You have resveratrol. You have pine extract, and on and on and on. So, people have encapsulated these into supplements, but really, I like to always talk about food because these antioxidants are much more diverse and readily available in food. And another thing that you could never get from a supplement or a prescription medication that you do get from food is you get this concept of synergy of how the constituents interact with each other to create an even more dynamic health effect. So this idea of, it's called emergent properties of plants, but that when the whole is greater than its parts concept, if you've heard that phrase, is essentially that these nutrients and these compounds and these plant dynamic, properties interface with each other, and nutrients interface with each other to actually create even more dynamic health benefits. So again, it's just further making these arguments to where you want to appreciate the value of whole food as, a food as medicine and food as life value to really nurture and honor if one of your focuses is accountability to your own personal health. So vitamins and minerals, again, when we process a food, not only do we strip the phytonutrients and fiber, we strip out the many of the vitamins and minerals. Those leave, like, all of the roughage part, the skins, the holes of things is where most of the vitamins reside. And the reason for that, by the way, in the nutrients is that, remember how I talked about how the plant is always trying to survive, and how it does that is it kind of creates properties to protect itself and survive. And one of the features of that is it pushes all the nutrients out to the edges of it's where it's most susceptible and vulnerable. And that's usually where we're going to find most of the nutrients, right? Um, so just kind of mentioning that in the way that we consume our foods is that peeling and skinning and removing this, everything is not necessarily the best idea, because we're throwing away a lot of the nutrients in that way. And certainly eating processed food hugely does that too. And I know you've heard me mention fiber a few times without being explicit. I'll be explicit for a second. Why fiber is so valuable is that our gut is, like, in my opinion, the crucial organ to care for if we're going to focus in on organ systems in the body, because it is where we extract all of our nutrition, but it's also where our immune system is kind of centers its intelligence. And it's where these trillions of microbes live in us that are hugely involved in countless facets of our health and well-being. And so fiber is the really necessary material to keep a gut healthy. So you keep hearing me talk about the fiber in whole fruits and vegetables and grains and seeds and nuts. It's because it has those dramatically important GI health ramifications. It's also how we make sure toxins leave our body efficiently. If we don't have enough fiber, we don't poop well. If we don't have enough fiber, we don't pull bile out of our liver, which is where a bunch of gunk and cholesterol and toxins are designed to leave our body from. So when we look at fiber content of foods, we find that the modern American diet consumes about 10 grams a day on average of fiber, whereas our ancestral diet was about 50 grams a day of fiber. That's a big difference, So again, how do we get there? We eat whole live foods. Okay. So that's a little bit of kind of debrief on the constituent of foods and what are in these whole live foods that we're consuming. That is kind of very, very crucial to our health and well-being, I'll say. The next thing we kind of can get into a little bit is, I guess I'll say, food cultivation. Since we've already kind of been touching on it, I just want to be a little more explicit. Like, the best way, and it's part of why I do this lecture this time of year, the most dynamic food you can consume is the freshest food that's traveled the least distance, that has the most soil residues on it. And so really, your home garden or your community supported agriculture, CSA, or local community co-op or local farm, these are the best resources of live dynamic food. They're going to retain the most phytonutrients, the most enzymes. They're going to have the highest density of nutrition. Also, partly because when things are shipped from thousands of miles away out of season, many of the foods are picked way early before they've attained a lot of their nutrient value. And so you're never going to get those nutrients. So again, practically speaking, we can only grow and access local live food about 7 months a year, but we can all endeavor to do that to the best of our ability and therefore have the highest quality of food. Then you have this partitioning of organic and inorganic, which again, that difference is meaningful. I'm not dismissing like, oh, why buy organic because they still have pesticides and herbicides? Well, yeah, they do have a version of that, but arguably a lot healthier than the higher level of toxicity of inorganic foods. So always making that selection is a better choice as a long-term investment in your health, if you can afford to do it. I actually, as a segue to hopefully the end of our talk, which I'll circle back to, with animal products and high fat containing foods, for example, nuts and seeds and oils, it's actually even more important to be organic and arguably grass-fed, wild-caught, pasture-raised, all of those terms. Because when we eat animal products or when we eat high-fat foods, we are concentrating up the food chain, as we like to say, or we're concentrating the storage of toxins. Toxins like to hang out in fat, and they like to be concentrated up the food chain. So when you eat 1 pound of beef, that to make that 1 pound of beef, that cow had to eat 10 pounds of plants. And that cow probably, in most situations, ate 10 pounds of pesticide, herbicide sprayed corn to make that 1 pound of beef. So you're having a lot more, we call them hormone modulating compounds, pesticide, herbicide residues, heavy metal residues, to make that 1 pound of meat. Whereas if it's from an organic, grass-fed, grass-finished cow, you still had to do those 10 pounds of grass, and you're still going to have more toxins overall, but you're going to basically end up with, just a lot less toxins accumulating in that meat. So that's something to point out, and just why I'm so big with dairy, meat, eggs, sourcing the cleanest possible and spending your money there if you're going to spend it somewhat, if you're going to spend extra to eat clean organic. Someone asked with nuts how this is true. Again, it has to do with how they're sprayed. So the toxins that get pressed into nuts and seeds in higher fat containing foods, they essentially will store much more concentrated in those fattier and plant products than they will in the higher carbohydrate fiber plant products. Okay, so let's kind of go forward now into how we select food. Okay, so what are we looking for when we go and purchase food? So first of all, we want to think about what are the different forms. And again, we're still focusing on plants, like fruits and vegetables primarily is really what I'm focusing on. But we want to look at freshness as a big ideal. So the optimal food is something, and you pick right out of your garden, you dust off, do a quick rinse, and you go prepare. That's going to be the most nutrient dense, most live phytonutrients, most enzymes. And then it just doesn't get stored for very long, right? So many plants, especially cruciferous vegetables, but many other types of fruits and vegetables, they lose nutrient value, degrades over time as they are stored, which is why if they get picked way early, not only do you not have all the nutrients built into the last ripening period, but they're also in transit and storage for a long time, which means further nutrients leave. So one principle that you can really work with, as much time as is involved, is you can go to the store more often to get live fruits and vegetables more regularly. Maybe you're going multiple times a week, at least once a week, to get live fresh fruits and vegetables, which are probably the healthiest version. Obviously, a lot of us have busy lives with lots of responsibilities, so that's not always practical. And so there's other food preparation methods or storage methods that I think are very valid that still preserve much of the phytonutrient and mineral vitamin integrity in our foods. And an example of that is going to be freeze drying, which is a very quick, sudden way to preserve our food and store for a later date. Also, just frozen fruits and vegetables are a good way to go, and still a very viable, high density version of nutrients. And then last, but still valid, is going to be canning. The big problem with canning is not necessarily the loss of nutrients, although obviously losing the freshness, they have some degradation. It's that, usually we buy canned goods in like BPA and petroleum product lined containers. And so those just are getting infused into the food, which are toxins. Furthermore, there's often a lot of preservatives that go into that process because it's more economical to just put preservatives in them than to take the time and energies to can them and then have them expire in a shorter term. So that's kind of a lot of the issue with canned food. If you can your own food in glass jars, most of these problems go away. Of course, that's a big process, involves a lot of effort, but a glass jar canned food is always going to be preferable if you're into that process. And that's a whole way that if you truly want to eat, from farm to table, theoretically, you could can a lot of foods or purchase canned stuff from clean sources, and that's one way to preserve other than freezing. And it's also true that a select kind of plants just store well. There's a lot of fall crops, a lot of root vegetables, a lot of winter squash that do tend to preserve pretty high nutrient values just when stored at a cool temperature for months on end. But a lot of these leafy greens, fresh fruits and vegetables, they do lose nutrient value pretty quickly as they sit on the shelves or sit in your fridge. And another thing to point out is just the idea of just having a really respectful relationship with our food. I mean, America is notorious for the most egregious country in the world that we throw away a third of our food. A third of our live food gets thrown away in our country. And that's just tragic when you have people starving all around the world. And throwing that food away in itself is energetically catastrophic, both from the waste of it, but also the energy it takes to produce it. And then because of all of the having everything available all the time, the fossil fuel resources we use and the waste we generate just getting food, into our bodies to the grocery store wrapped in plastic or prepackaged. So, another layer, if your ecological heart is in this process too, is to, bring your own baggies and shop in the bulk sections and only, purchase things where you just literally are looking at the food you're consuming as recognizing, oh, this is an apple, this is a pepper, this is a whole grain, this is a bean. When you physically look at it, you know what it is. That's just a good rule of thumb if you're really trying to move toward that peak of what I think is a sustainable relationship for us humans to have with our food. And it's a lot of effort and a big commitment to do that. And I think I would be lying if I said that I am 100% there, but I continue to aspire toward it and put a lot of energy and time into that relationship process. Okay. So then when we've talked about food selection, by the way, food that looks pretty is not necessarily the healthiest. Some foods, actually, the uglier the surface, the healthier it is. And I kind of told you about how our wild ancestral foods looked very different than our modern ones. So ugly fruit and vegetables are not necessarily less nutrient replete vegetables. Just kind of to mention that and put that out there. Additionally, there's something about the phytonutrient conversation to mention when we're consuming fruits and vegetables that is just a really good wisdom, which is to eat a rainbow of fruits and vegetables, right? To not eat all one color. Basically, all of those different differentiation of colors also denotes differentiation of a spectrum of phytonutrients in them. And that's, one of the reasons why with fruit, I love berries so much, is there's just such these rich colors, and they indeed have some of the highest antioxidant phytonutrient values of arguably any food. It's one of those things too, where they're not devalued too much in their nutrient concentration by freezing them. So I love me some bags of frozen berries from Costco that go into my smoothies every single day, which I have as one of my major meals every day is a smoothie. That's one of the main ingredients. So yeah, just kind of that mention of eating the rainbow. And another mention too that is worth sharing is there are some really good just basic lists out there about inorganic versus organic, the healthiest choices when you're having to decide between those. And again, my argument is always, if you're going to eat animal products, that's where to go organic, grass-fed first and foremost. But then with food, I would really, argue that the dirty dozen, clean 15 list, if you guys have heard of that, it's a really simple one to look up online. To mention, what the most toxin, pesticide, herbicide laden foods are, versus what the relatively cleanest ones with residues are. And there's a whole website that I just love for the impacts of environment on what we put in and on our body. Or like expose our body to. It's called the Environmental Working Group, or EWG.org. That's a really nice location to like learn about foods, skincare, household products. It basically grades everything and gives things a value, and I trust them pretty well. So just a little disclaimer there. When we get into the next piece, so we've already talked about how we select our food, how we grow our food, where it comes from, how frequently we get it, what forms we, purchase them in. The next big thing to talk about is preparation. How do we prepare our foods to preserve the highest density of nutrition and receive the greatest health benefits? This is an interesting topic because in a simplified world where we were all living very relaxed lives and able to chill out and consume our food in community and have really good blood flow and nerve supply to our guts, then I would say the best food to eat is raw food. We can extract the nutrition and the enzymes in that raw food and the phytonutrients completely when it's in its raw form, versus if it's cooked, a lot of those phytonutrients dissipate. A lot of the enzymes that help us digest it get boiled away. So it's optimal in its raw form. However, also in its raw form, it's harder to extract through our digestion. We need more digestive fire, more digestive enzymes, more chewing, more relaxation to fully extract that nutrition. And most of us in our modern world are not in that mode. So it's not a toss-up, but it's just it's complex to say raw versus cooked. The other thing about cooked is, even though you lose some of the phytonutrients and enzymes, you concentrate the nutrients also generally. Like, say when you cook down a pound of spinach and you consume the spinach with the water, that might be only a few mouthfuls, whereas you'd eat a pound of spinach raw, that might take you several sittings to get that all down. So when you cook things, you definitely like concentrate, shrink it down and therefore, to some degree, eat a higher density of nutrients, even though you're losing a lot of the nutrients. Hopefully that makes sense. There are a couple exceptions to where I believe that raw is not the best choice. I mean, an obvious one is, right, when we talk about mini grains and beans, clearly you just aren't going to digest them in their raw form. So eating them raw is really not going to convey as much nutritional value. They actually need to be cooked to access the nutrients in them. Same statement with mushrooms. Actually, mushrooms have some tremendous health benefits. When we eat mushrooms raw, we're really only doing our body a disservice in terms of eating more fiber. A lot of the nutrient constituents do not get activated and made bioavailable until you break down the cell walls of the mushrooms. It's also called chitin, and you can only do that when you cook them. So that's one of those places where I'd always encourage cooked consumption of mushrooms. Nuts and seeds have a little bit of a different angle, but the principle with nuts and seeds is they have what is called phytic acid in them. And phytic acid is kind of also called an anti-nutrient because it blocks absorption and utilization in the human body of many of the nutrients contained in those nuts and seeds. And beans also have them too. And so when we roast with low temperature, because if we do high temperature roasting, we actually make the oils in the nuts rancid, or basically transform them into harmful chemicals in our body. So under 250 degrees for roasting, usually for about an hour, or if we soak or sprout nuts and seeds, we remove that phytic acid, and simultaneously we make the nutrients even more accessible and available to us. So again, if you take the time to do those processes, it's really rewarding for the nutrient value of your foods. And I still, again, with grains and seeds, still really go about that process of encouraging soaking and rinsing regardless. Beans, I should say, beans and grains. And then when you prepare those, I really feel like a pressure cooker is actually a great device to consume beans, particularly, but also grains, because with the pressurization, you end up being able to cook them at a lower temperature. And you remove another compound that's especially prominent in grains and beans, also some fruits and vegetables, which are called lectins. And lectins can generally be irritating to the immune system, especially when it comes to depending on what your blood type is. And that's a whole nother lecture topic I've actually done before, but the lectins, which are unique signature compounds, unique to different foods, can be immunologically reactive, again, depending on which fruit or vegetable or blood type interface you're consuming and how your immune system responds to it. Okay. So again, moving into different food preparation models, the next step below raw food consumption is going to be lightly steaming. Lightly steaming just starts to break down some of that cellulose and harsh fiber structure. So some of those nutrients are more readily available for us to assimilate. Probably after that would be boiling and sauteing. The key thing with boiling and sauteing is when you do this with fruits and vegetables, then you're not going to, if you throw away the water or the liquid, you're going to throw a huge amount of the nutrients out with it. So I generally try to avoid boiling unless I'm going to make a soup, because if I make a soup, then I'm going to, slurp up all of those nutrients in the soup itself. Plus, soups are great because they keep really well and they almost taste better the next day, and they're great leftovers. And I just have a busy kind of schedule in my life, and I just have to have leftovers with my foods. And so soups work really nice. So then you're drinking the fluids if you're doing that. The next would be roasting. Roasting at low heat can preserve nutrient value better, but it makes veggies more soggy. So to get them crispy, it's better to do them at high heats. I really like to emphasize, in this whole discussion of cooking, we're mostly not cooking most of our veggies just on their own. We're usually using some sort of oil. So this is a good reminder to mention to everybody, what are the best oils to consume and in what versions? So generally speaking, my favorite very low heat, under 250 degrees cooking oil or raw oil is extra virgin olive oil. It's got to be extra virgin because of the way that they don't refine it and process it. That's an excellent way to consume our raw foods, and really lightly cooked. Flax oil is also good exclusively for raw foods, but it has to be very carefully kept in the fridge so it doesn't go rancid. High heat cooking, there are several oils to be considered, but my favorite oil is clarified butter, which is butter with the milk protein removed. You can buy it organic, grass-fed at a place like Costco, Trader Joe's, or health food store, or you can make it on your own. It doesn't take too long to make, but it's really great because it doesn't have the dairy components, but it has a really, really high smoke point, meaning you can cook as high as you want without compromising the oil. And yes, it is a saturated fat. That's why it's a safe high heat cooking oil. But I'm not scared of saturated fats. I think they're perfectly healthy to consume in moderate quantities. So actually, when I roast veggies, I always heat up some clarified butter and coat the veggies in that before roasting. And then the probably most unhealthy way to cook is sad to say as we move into the quote unquote barbecue season, but it's the barbecues, right? It's the very high heat searing in the blackening and charring of our vegetables and fruits. And what's even worse is when we do that with meat, because we do this thing called the Maillard reaction that is much more carcinogenic to the process of consuming that browned, charred food when it's an animal product. And it's even more toxic if we do some sort of marinade that has sugar in it, and the sugar and the protein of the animal product combine in this reaction. So, I mean, again, I use my barbecue from time to time. I just think that, it's not our favorite, bestest way to be preparing foods when we have all these other options. I should mention too, because I know we're wrapping up on time here, but I started a little late, so I'll go a little extra, is that food storage, right? This is a big topic and I can really get into the weeds, but generally, like we said, we don't want to store fresh food as very long if we can avoid it. If we are going to store it, we should put it in semi-permeable bags, like not plastic bags, but either plastic with semi-permeability or your own mesh bags you can like grab for your produce. That's a really good way to go. And we always want to put it in the lowest drawer where it preserves the coldest temperatures and greatest humidity for our fruits and vegetables in our fridge. Some things don't really matter and you can keep them, out like onions or potatoes or winter squash. I mean, obviously that's not a refrigerated food. And because of their thick skins, the nutritional value really is preserved very well for a long time. But yeah, kind of ways of storage are valuable to know. So then what we haven't really got into too much is we haven't really talked about animal products today. And, I feel like just because I'm really holding into a seasonal conversation that I'd really like to keep it on plants and fruits and vegetables, because that's really where we're coming into season where all these fresh things are available to us. So, we'll put a pin in that and I'll probably do another additional lecture that, I can really lean in on animal products more. Again, the emphasis here is the plants, and something to speak seasonally above and beyond just the availability of fresh fruits and vegetables is the concept in Chinese medicine that I feel is very true and I guide my patients in every day, which is the idea of eating seasonally appropriately. And so we're kind of coming into that season where fresh, live, raw fruits and vegetables, or if we're concentrating those fruits and vegetables in the form of fresh pressed vegetable juices, we think of these kind of foods like salads, for example, as very cooling to the body. So as we come into these really hot months, to balance our equilibrium, cooling foods are more desirable. Whereas when we're in the dead of cold winter, then warming foods are much more nourishing and balancing. So like soups and stews and hot beverages and warmed foods and cooked foods, from a Chinese medicine perspective, are seen as most appropriate. So just kind of throwing that out there as you articulate, your food relationships and how you want to evolve that. I find it works best for most people. Obviously, disclaimer, if you have individual disturbance patterns in your health that need you to eat more cooked food or eat more live food, then that would, kind of supersede this idea of eating with the seasons. But generally, I think it's a really wise principle for all of us. And, another thing is just ending on this note, of kind of referring back to some resources for y'all if you really want to nerd out on food. There's two books that I really enjoyed. They're enjoyable reads. They'll teach you a lot. One is called Eating on the Wild Side by Joe Robinson. I'll put the name in the chat, Joe Robinson, Eating on the Wild Side. And the other one is The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. So he does a lot to just speak of both of these books. I drew a lot from to do this lecture, and they're just such good reads. So if you're inspired to kind of go, nudge up to food as medicine learning, it'll be a lot less condensed than this lecture, but a lot more depth and detail, which I think is pretty cool. And there's all sorts of little things like, the tops of beets being more nutritious than the beets, and lettuce, when you tear it, actually having more nutrient value for 24 hours. And it goes on and on. Like, there's all these little beautiful takeaway tips you can take with food relationship that just in perpetuity will serve, the scientific research has borne out this information that will just serve your health better. So I really recommend those books. And I think one of the statements that Michael Pollan made is just an overarching, he was looking at the research in the blue zones, which are the people who many people live over 100 years old, of what is it about that helps that. And nutritionally, one of the things they said is eat plants and not too much, meaning don't overeat. So I think that's kind of what I was stating in just focusing this meeting on plants. Is, just they're definitely the most dynamic for so many reasons for our health, all the phytonutrients, fiber, protective antioxidant constituents, vitamins and minerals. Like, this is what we should be eating as the bigger part of our plate. What we didn't talk about is the not too much, but this is one that I will be in a lifelong process of learning and continuing to improve in my own health journey, is just not overeating, not eating too many calories, not overeating into a meal. Although that's not really the topic of today, it's a good note to end on, that we can even eat too much of a good thing, right? And so, and I also think what goes with that is eating an environment that's conducive to digestion, right? If we say raw foods are the most nutrient dense, but we got to be in an environment to assimilate our food well, then we need to, take the time to sit down at the dinner table with our family and really chew and savor our meal in good company. So try to make that an honored, tradition, or move toward a greater honoring of that if it isn't as much of a relationship principle in your life. So I think I'll wrap there. We're a little beyond our hour. So appreciate anybody who just was able to tune in live to this. This will be posted online for other people to consume too. And happy gardening. And basically, I wish you all the best in your health pursuits and your food as medicine pursuits. So I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. Thanks again.